Hey guys, and welcome to another Mammoth Interactive tutorial on elements of the Swift 3 programming language. This tutorial will be focusing on if statements and on several derivations of the if statement. So we'll go into detail in just a little bit here. I'm just in the playground, so I went into Xcode, started it up, and just clicked on create a new playground. This one I just named Intro to If Statements, but you can name it and save it however you want. So we're going to be talking about if statements. And if statements are a way to introduce what we call control flow into our code. So they allow us to basically test a condition and execute code based on the outcome. So I'll just write that in a comment. So if statements, in fact I'll capitalize it, let's be proper. So if statements allow us to test a condition and execute code based on the outcome of that test. So typically it works kind of like a true or false. So we have, I'll just set one up. So if we have an if, and let's just choose the Swift if statement. Okay, that's kind of a mouthful to say. So basically we have the if statement set up in such a way where we have some kind of a condition and then some kind of code to execute. So we can choose to include brackets or not. So we can, let's just say, let's just call this sum test. And we can put this test in brackets, or we can leave them out. Really is just up personal preference. In a lot of other languages, you have to use the brackets. So generally, that's what I do, just kind of out of habit. But like I said, it's fine to exclude them. So here we have just code to execute if test passes. So basically, again, we'll have some kind of a code, some kind of a test. So we'll say if some test passes, then we'll execute this code. So again, we always test some kind of a condition. So this could be, maybe if something equals something, if something is greater than something, if something is true. It could be any variation on any kind of a test, but basically this will return some kind of a true statement, and if it's true, then it will execute this code, whatever's within these two curly braces here. So there's the first curly brace, there's the second. It will execute this code if this test passes, and if this test does not pass, then it will not execute anything within these braces, and it will just skip over it as if these aren't even there. So if the test does not pass, then it will just kind of treat everything in here as a comment. And just so happens that it is a comment, but that's fine. Okay, so that's a basic if statement. Now there are many variations. We're going to be looking at stuff like, let's see, so we will look at, and let's just write some things that we will see. We'll look at if statements, just a regular if. Then we can look at double ifs, and then we can look at stuff like multiple conditions in one if statement. Then we can look at stuff like else if statements. Then we can look at stuff like else statements. There we go, that's the correct spelling. And then we'll finish up with stuff like if let statements, which actually aren't so much like the regular if statements at all, but we'll get more into that later. Okay, so these are just some of the topics we'll be looking at down here. I've included these as a comment for your guys' benefit. This is what a basic if statement looks like. We'll jump right in with a simple if statement using a simple example. And yeah, so you'll find that if statements are very useful. We'll use them all the time in code. So this is a really great tutorial to get the hang of. So pay close attention, learn a lot, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so in this part of our tutorial, we're just going to see a basic if statement in action. So I'm going to show you how if statements work, and we're going to see how the code kind of flows from line to line through an if statement. Okay, and we're also going to use this example of a true-false test to demonstrate this, where we'll basically have some questions and answers, and we'll just test to see if they're equal and run some code accordingly if they are. So now we've seen basic if statements in action. Let's take a look at an if statement applied to kind of like a true-false test idea. So let's see, we have a true-false test, and I'm just writing this in a comment again, that's why we have the double slashes in the green. So it's going to be a true-false test, and we want to check our answers and record our score. Okay, so the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create some Boolean variables. So let's say our variable, let's call this question 1, and let's consider this to be our answer to the first question, and we're going to give this a value of true, and there we go, we see true appearing right there. Okay, and we're going to have a constant, and this is going to be answer 1. And the reason I assign them as such is because if it's the answer to a question, so if this is the actual correct answer, I think it should be a constant because that shouldn't really change. I mean, if the answer key says it's true, then that should be the real answer. So we'll have this one be true as well. And we'll have question 2, again of type Boolean. So again, you can give these answers if you want, or rather you can give these a type, so in this case Boolean, or you can just leave it blank, but I think it's good practice to include the type for now, at least until you're very familiar with it. And this one should actually be answer 2. And we're going to let this one be true. So perhaps we only got 1 out of 2 on this test. So again, the constant or the answers are constant because that should be the real answer and that should never change. Whereas our answers, which are going to be question 1 and question 2, I'm going to leave as variables because perhaps we want to change our mind halfway through the test. Okay, so that would be a good example of where to use variables rather than constants. So constants you'll use if you know for sure that this variable, or rather this constant, is going to contain this value always, whereas variables are better if you think you might want to change that value at some point. Okay, and then we're going to have this other variable, and this one's going to be a variable because it will change. This one's going to be score, type int, and we're just going to initialize this to be 0 right now. Okay, so we could initialize this to be an optional and have no value, but I think it's appropriate to leave it as 0 because until we've answered some questions right, we will have a 0 score. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to first test if our first answer is right, and then we'll test our second answer. So basically, we set up our if statement, and we want to see if question 1 equals answer 1, and if it does, we're going to have some kind of a result. So a handy trick with if statements is if we just open the braces here and then press enter, you see it automatically sets up the second brace and indents our second line for us. Okay, so that's just a feature of the playground. And so this is basically testing to see if question 1 and answer 1 are equal. So does this variable and this constant have the same value? Well, in this case they do, so whatever we put in these braces will be true, and we'll just have score plus plus. So basically this is just adding 1 to the score. Oh, and this is unavailable, it's been removed in Swift 3. So what we're going to do is a plus equal 1. So this is basically, if you haven't seen this operator before, this is basically the same as saying score equals score plus 1. Okay, so it's just a slightly shorter form. So it's taking the current value and adding whatever we put there. Okay, so just so you know, that's what that is. Okay, so yeah, basically we're saying if we get this question right, so if our answer matches the real answer, then we add 1 to the score. Okay, and our next case will be testing the next question. So if question 2 equals answer 2, then we're going to increase the score once more. And at the end of it all, I want to display score. Okay, so what we are doing here, just to recap, is we're first testing to see if question 1 equals answer 1. So to see if our answer is the same as the real answer. If that's true, we're going to get this we're going to execute this code. If it's not, then we'll skip over it. And then we have another if statement testing the same thing for question 2 and answer 2. Okay, and at the end of it all, we print out score, and score is equal to 1. Now the reason score is equal to 1 is because the first question and the first answer are the same, so this test passes and we add 1 to score. However, for the second one, we put false, whereas the answer should be true, so we don't get 1 for this score, because this test failed, returned a false value, and so we skip whatever is in this between this brace and this brace. Okay, so that's how if statements work. We always test this kind of condition here. If this passes, if this test returns true, then we'll execute whatever code is in these braces here, and if it's not, we just skip over it and move on to the next lines of code. Okay, so that's a basic if statement in action applied to a true-false test. Another thing to note is going to be the double equals. Now single equals that you see here are for variable assignments, whereas the double equals are for tests. Okay, so anytime you're testing something, and we saw this with the booleans as well, so anytime you're testing something, you want to have the double equals. So just to recap with booleans, let's create this variable and we'll call this a bool, and we'll give the type boolean. And if you recall from our variables tutorial, we could do something like this. We could give it a condition, so 5 equals 5 for example, and it will return true. And that's basically because this is testing this condition. Does this side equal this side? Does 5 equal 5? And if it does, then we'll return true, and so we get true as this value. Okay, so always use these double equals when testing values, and the single equals when assigning values. Okay, so that's a basic if statement in action. We saw 2 in a row. Just to recap, we want to test this condition using the double equals. If it's true, then we'll execute this code. If it's not, we skip over that code and move on to the next one. Okay, so in this case, only one of these 2 tests passed, so we only get a score of 1 at the end. Okay, so next time we'll take a look at testing multiple conditions within one if statement. Alright, so in this part of our tutorial, we just demonstrated how an if statement worked. So basically, to recap, we have a condition to test that's right after the if, and then we have some curly braces, and within those braces we have some code that executes only if the condition is true. So if the condition tested right after the if statement is true, we execute the code in the curly braces, and if it's false, so if that test fails, then we just skip right over everything in those braces and move on to the next lines. We use the example of a multiple choice test to demonstrate this, where we had some questions and answers, and we tested to see if they were equal, and if they weren't, then we didn't add anything to score, and if they were equal, we added something to score, and then at the end printed out the score. Okay, so true-false tests, good example of demonstrating a simple if statement.